George. Thank you for coming along this afternoon. It's great to see you. You are obviously the director of the Wave Trust, which Fiona of SAM is the ambassador for, and also myself recently. And you've come to join with us today to talk about the objectives of the 70/30 campaign to reduce child maltreatment, and also to reduce trauma in children up to the 2030. So let's hope that we can manage that and get that reduced. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Fiona, Sam, Sarah, and others for inviting me to speak at your very exciting meeting. I've been reading some of your background papers, the very strong struggle you're having with the Scottish government to get recognition of many of the points that you are very validly making to them. I'm sorry that it's proving such an uphill struggle, but we're not strangers to uphill struggles in Wave. And my advice to you is just keep at it. It's impossible to overstate what can be achieved if you just keep going, keep providing the evidence. Eventually the resistance will break down. So I'm going to start just by telling you a little bit about my own journey in this. I have a very strange background to be involved, as I now am very heavily in the world of trauma, and particularly childhood trauma. I actually spent most of my life, I'm quite old, I'm 79 years old. I spent most of my life working in the field of international business. I used to jet set around the world, traveling to countries from Japan to Bangladesh to Morocco to what used to be called Zaire to Costa Rica or United States, wherever it was, very often sorting out strategies and solving problems for large multinational corporations. A very different life from that I've been leading more recently. I was in the 1990s the managing director of an international strategy consultancy, and that strategy consultancy made a decision. Actually, I persuaded them to make a decision to give 1% of our revenue every year to support charities. And we supported different charities. Sometimes it was Oxfam, the Children's Society, various other organizations. But one year it was the NSPCC. And because it was the NSPCC, although I'd had no particular interest in child abuse before that, I decided to do some more research on the subject of child abuse. And part of that was just simply, when cases of child abuse appeared in the newspapers, reading a lot more about them than I might have done otherwise. And I was living in London at that time. I'm back in Scotland now, but at that time I was living in London. And during that year, there were 2 children in London murdered by their parents. And I read in the Evening Standard in London the multi-page spreads on what had happened in these families prior to being murdered. And I'm sorry to say I came to the conclusion that being murdered was the best thing that ever happened to these children. They had actually suffered such unspeakable torture before being murdered that it was a merciful release from what was going on. And I was utterly shocked. Until that point, if anyone talked to me about child abuse, I kind of pictured a parent just losing their temper, hitting the child too hard, kind of losing the rag for a little while and then calming down again. I had no idea that parents sometimes, obviously it's an exception, but sometimes go so far as to inflict systematic torture on their children. And something snapped inside me when I discovered that this was not something that was entirely unheard of. And a decision got made. And I've never been able to say that I made the decision. It's always felt more like the decision made me. The decision was, I can't live in a world where things like this happen to children and I do nothing about it. Problem was, I didn't know what to do. I had no idea why anybody would ever abuse a child, and I didn't have a clue what to do, even if someone did abuse a child. So I started just reading a lot. There's a wonderful writer, if anyone's interested in the topic, called brilliant books on the subject. Um, she's a Swiss psychiatrist, including, very interestingly, one book on the life of Adolf Hitler and what turned Adolf Hitler into the person he became. I think that particular book is called For Your Own Good. But she's written a number of excellent books. But I still kind of was learning about the subject, but didn't know what to do. And then in 1995, there was a speech by the then president of the NSPCC, and he was talking about the 50 years since the end of the Second World War, 1945 to 1995. And during his speech, he said that in those 50 years, levels of child abuse in Britain had not gone down one iota. And I was kind of shocked. I'd kind of always imagined, we were supporting the NSPCC financially, that what they were doing was making levels of child abuse reduce. And that they were not reducing even after 50 years really struck me very hard. And one of my jobs in my previous career had been with a large multinational corporation called Unilever. And working for Unilever, I was sent around the world as an international troubleshooter. And I would go to these countries in all the various continents and be given problems to solve. And I was normally given 2 weeks in a country to solve a problem. And if I hadn't solved the problem in 2 weeks, I needed to have left an action plan, which I was confident would solve the problem. And I remember thinking to myself, if I'd walked into the headquarters of Unilever House in Blackfriars in London and told them I'd been working on a problem for 50 years and still hadn't solved it, my Unilever career wouldn't have lasted another 2 minutes. So I began to think about it and I thought, well, hang on, George, you're a strategy consultant. If someone gave you the challenge, solve child abuse as a strategy project, what would you do? So I thought, okay, well, the first thing you do in a strategy project is you survey the existing terrain of the subject you're asked to look at. And I'd been trained by Unilever to think globally whenever I looked at anything. So I actually studied how governments and charities all over the world were tackling child abuse. And I found the same thing everywhere across the world. Charities everywhere, including at that time the NSPCC, were reacting to child abuse by intervening after it happened. They weren't preventing it before it happened. They were intervening after it happened and dealing with the symptoms of child abuse. But I'd learned in my business career, if you have a deep-seated problem that won't go away, you have to understand the root causes of that problem and tackle the root causes, not the presenting symptoms. One way that I did that was with the issue of cost. Lots of businesses get into financial trouble. Among my strange backgrounds, I'm an economist, an accountant, a psychologist, and I became, through my interest in WAVE and child abuse, a clinical criminologist and a traumatic stress therapist. But I knew that accountants are really, really good at measuring the costs in a business, but they're actually not very good, in my experience, at stopping unnecessary costs. It takes a different mindset, which is different from the way accountants think. Luckily, I'd been trained in that by a very brilliant Dutchman when I was working for Unilever. And he trained me to look at the causes of cost in the business, which are very different from the things that are measured by accountants. And because I learned how to measure the causes of costs in business, after I left Unilever, I operated as a consultant, turning around loss-making businesses. And I've turned around 29 international loss-making businesses in my career by finding and tackling the root causes of cost. So I thought, well, what if I did that with child abuse? I need to find out the root causes of child abuse. So not knowing what they were, I went back to university. My first university was Glasgow University, studying economics. I then done psychology at Birmingham University. So I then done psychology at London University. I went back to university for a third time, this time to Birmingham, to become a clinical criminologist, in which I studied child abuse and neglect and their root causes. And I studied that for 2 years at Birmingham. And during that time, talking to people about the causes of root cost, and having looked all over the world and found no charity anywhere which was tackling the root causes, I set up Wave Trust, to tackle the root causes of child abuse and neglect. And we've now been working on that for 27 years. I discovered quite early on that child abuse and neglect cause trauma in people. And I didn't understand trauma either. So I went back to university for a fourth time, this time in Nottingham Trent University. And I trained there for 2 years, and took out an advanced diploma in the management of psychological trauma. I like learning, as you might gather by now. And I actually began to work with violent men in prison to heal the trauma that caused them to be violent. Because I'd learned that childhood trauma in some people, fortunately not in the majority of people, but in some people, has them react by developing violent personalities. And I became an expert on the subject of violence. I became an advisor to the UK government, the Metropolitan Police, the Scottish government, the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, on how to reduce violence. But the first step in reducing violence is to stop child abuse and neglect in society. After a while, I became quite frustrated. I was an advisor to 10 Downing Street at this time. I was an advisor to the Cabinet Office. I'd been an advisor to the Home Office. But the policies that I believed were necessary to reduce child abuse were still not being put in place. So I decided to try a technique that I'd used in business, that had worked really well in business. And that was invite an organization to create a vision for itself which didn't seem possible and which people didn't believe in, but invited people to act as if it was possible. And it was quite difficult initially to get people to start thinking, well, I know you say it's impossible for us to double our size or stop being loss making and become profit making or whatever it might be. We've tried everything and it doesn't work. But I worked with them on this. And I found that if you persisted, after a while, people stopped saying, this will never work, and started saying, well, let's imagine it could work. What would we do if it could work? And when you started getting them to use their creativity to say, if it could work, well, I guess we do X, Y, and Z. After a while, you start to get them thinking, well, maybe we should do X, Y, and Z. And suddenly they start doing things that they never previously thought were possible or practical. And hey, bingo, in the business world, this had worked for me over and over again. So I thought, let me try it in the social and political world. And I thought to myself, what we need is a target for reducing child abuse and neglect. And I actually added to that reducing domestic violence, because children witnessing domestic violence is also very traumatic and can result in violent personalities. So I spent about a year doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of experts on, just imagine that government was willing to do everything that it could do. I know that's a huge assumption, but just imagine they were willing to. How much could we reduce child abuse, neglect, and people witnessing domestic violence by? And I got varying answers from 50%, 80% over a period of years. And we actually developed a model, a computer model, which we used to estimate what could be done just using the then known effectiveness of many of the programs that we had discovered. I didn't mention one of the things WAVE did was to search the world for the best known programs for tackling abuse, neglect, and domestic violence, and trying to introduce those programs to the UK. And we've actually introduced two of those programs to Scotland. They're called Family Nurse Partnership and Roots of Empathy. And across the UK, those two programs we brought to the UK have benefited over 90,000 children and families since WAVE brought them to the UK. So we were busy working at that level as well. But the 70-30 campaign was initially mainly aimed at government. So we created a campaign which had a target of a 70% reduction in child abuse and neglect by the year 2030. And we started talking to people about it, and they all said to us, George, it's not realistic. It's never going to happen. We haven't reduced violence by now, another 10 years have gone by. In the last 60 years, we haven't reduced child abuse and neglect in the last 60 years. We'll never reduce it by, we might do 5% or even 10%, but never 70%. And I said, I know, probably isn't possible because the challenge is to get political. We're going to work on getting political buy-in, and we'll still continue looking for global best practice interventions. Well, I'll cut long story short. We produced action plans that demonstrate how to deliver 70-30. We produced one in England, which we presented to the UK Treasury. The UK Treasury spent 6 months studying it. At the end of 6 months, they said, we want to test this. And they actually voted £15 million in what they call the Autumn Statement in 2014 to test our ideas. That was in 2014, the Autumn Statement. We were told in December that this money would be provided to test our ideas. There was a general election in the UK in 2015. A new government came in whose top priority was cutting costs. And they took away the £15 million. We tried very hard to persuade them not to, but they did. So that didn't work. We tried various other things, but mainly what we did is we created a team of ambassadors around the country, people like Fiona and Sarah and many others, and we trained them how to talk to their members of parliament, how to talk to their MSPs, how to talk to their local councillors, and get them interested in supporting 70-30. Our ambassadors have been fantastic. They have been so powerful, you would hardly believe it. Would you believe 90% of MPs in the UK Parliament now support the 70-30 campaign? 90%, well, it's over 90%, it's about 93% at the moment. Would you believe 99% of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, all but one, 128 out of 129, support the 70-30 campaign? Every single MP in Scotland supports the 70-30 campaign. Recently, we started trying to persuade local authorities in Scotland to support the 70-30 campaign. There are 32. Currently, we have 8 who have signed up to support the 70-30 campaign. Now, this is brilliant because we're not going to succeed without the political backing. By the way, we've also got the 70-30 campaign backed in the Liberal Democrat General Election Manifesto 2010, and the Liberal Democrat Party have supported policy ever since. It's been supported by the Welsh Conservative Party, by the Welsh Nationalist Party, by the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland, and by the Conservative Party in Scotland. It was in the Labour Party manifesto, in the last Scottish Labour manifesto of the Scottish election campaign, and the Scottish Government gave it their backing in a written letter to us last year. Every party in the Scottish Parliament now supports the campaign. Job done, you might think. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I won't say it's easy, but it's relatively easy to get a politician to say they support something. That's the easy bit. The difficult bit is getting them to do something about it, to really put the policies in place. So last year, we were running in the Scottish Parliament a cross-party group for the prevention and healing of adverse childhood experiences. We invited that cross-party group to set up a national Scottish Commission of Inquiry into how to deliver 70-30 in Scotland. And they did. And that was set up in May of last year. It is chaired by a man called Sir Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, really one of the brilliant thinkers and most eminent people in the health field in Scotland. He's been an advisor to the Scottish Government for nearly 20 years. We got a lady called Linda de Castiger, who's the Director of Public Health for Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which is the largest NHS trust in the whole of the United Kingdom. She joined the commission. We got Gabe Docherty, who's the Director of Public Health for an NHS Lanarkshire, and was one of the key coordinators of Directors of Public Health across Scotland onto the trust. We got a man called Mike Fowlis, who was the top civil servant for children and families in Scotland for a number of years, now retired. He joined the commission. We got numerous professors, Phil Wilson, Professor of Early Years at the University of Aberdeen, Professor Mark Bellis, who's run the Adverse Childhood Experience Studies for the World Health Organization and the English and Welsh governments. I could go on. We've got the voice of lived experience, people who've suffered trauma of various kinds, childhood abuse, neglect, domestic violence, also as members of the commission. And we've been working for 1 year now, taking evidence. We've received over 250 written documents of evidence of how we can achieve the 70-30 goal. We have orally interviewed by Zoom, I think it's nearly 30 international experts, both Scottish and international experts, on various aspects of achieving the 70-30 campaign. I am sitting on a mountain of evidence at the moment. Unfortunately, we have so far failed to raise the funding to carry our work forward. So actually, I spent the last 2 months with other people in WAVE and with many of our commission members writing an application to Robertson Trust, the largest funder in Scotland. And that application only became ready about 1 hour ago. We've been working on it for 2 months. We're expecting to submit it today. And we've got our fingers crossed because it asks Robertson Trust to fund the next 5 years of the 70-30 campaign. That's where we've got to. I'll stop speaking now. I could go on forever on this topic. I'm passionate about it. I've devoted my life to it. Harry Burns and I, Harry's also in his 70s, we really want to be retired. we've millions of things we want to do with our children and grandchildren. Both of us have agreed this is one mission, one passion, one thing we both want to achieve before we die. And our wives have been very patient and agreed that we can do that. But we need all the help we can get. So if anybody else wants to become a 70/30 ambassador, talk to me, talk to Fiona, talk to Sarah. We'd love to have you. But I'd also like to know how any of my knowledge can help any of you in the challenges you're facing and your organization is facing. So when I shut up, which I promise I will do very shortly, I'd love to hear any questions you've got, whether it's about 70/30 or adult adoption or any other topics of interest where I might have something to say to you. So I'll stop.
George, thank you. I mean, the journey that you have been on is, I mean, I think so many of us can probably, kind of sit there and go, wow, what a journey, and the things that you've found out, the things that you've put your heart and soul into, and you've looked at, these are things that other people have never asked these questions, these why questions. And I think it's mind-blowing how far Wave Trust have come, how much Wave Trust have done to raise awareness alone is amazing. I am an ambassador for the Wave Trust, so yes, I am passionate about slightly passionate. I would talk like George and wouldn't stop. I'm not going to ask George questions because I know them all. So I'm actually, well, I don't know them all, but I've always got the opportunity to message. So I'm going to let the floor open to the panel and to the questions, and I'll monitor the Q&A while we're going along, and I'll pop some in for the girls. But yeah, Dawn, you've got your hand up first, so I'll let you go first.
George, absolutely. Thank you. You're the first person who's come on, and of all the people who've spoken, you have absolutely cracked it. And if you can pull this off, honest to God, you'll make the difference. You'll make the difference to tomorrow's children. And you've got the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. It's been a long journey. When I started, I thought it would be a 500-year journey. I'm more optimistic now. I now think it's perhaps a 120-year journey rather than 500 years. Because we've learned so much about being effective in the interim. But it's not going to be finished by me, much as I would love to be around to see that in 120 years' time. So it does need other people to pick up the baton and run with it. So any of you who feel inclined, while solving the problems of adult adoption at the same time, of course, you're very welcome to pick up the baton and run. Some of you are going to be a lot younger than I am.
Thank you.
Fiona, are you going to pick the speakers, or shall I just take them from the
No,
screen?
Sarah, you're next. You can.
Okay. Hi, George. It's so lovely to meet you. Finally.
Yes.
How are you feeling this afternoon?
I'm great. I'm enjoying the Ayrshire sunshine today.
Oh, good.
And I moved up to. I've permanently moved to London. Sorry, moved from London last December. I was splitting my time 50/50 between London and Scotland for about 6 or 7 years,
Oh, wow.
having spent far too long in my life. I left Glasgow in 1966 with the intention to come back 7 years later. It took me more like 50 years to do so, but I'm very glad I did.
Well, we're glad to have you here, and it's so nice that you've come on to our webinar today. So, thank you for that. One of the questions I got to ask, obviously, I'm quite passionate about reducing childhood trauma, and what I wanted to ask you is that if you feel, because you said earlier about the fact that there just isn't enough there's lots of politicians that saying, yes, I want to support the campaign, but there doesn't seem to be enough projection of funding and ability to assert the campaign politically into the centre. And I just wondered if a lot of what is happening is down to there's what I'm trying to say is there's so much generational trauma that has caused so much trauma that there is now in 2023 amongst adults who are now growing up in 2023. And what I'm trying to say is until we assert trauma into the centre, like through Wave Trust, for example, then we're really not going to get to the root of the cause of the conversation. We're just not going to get there. And I just wonder from you, how do we progress with that forward? Both as an, I suppose, as an ambassador, but also as somebody who, you know, both Fiona and I are quite passionate about ending this, not necessarily ending, but at least reducing it, as you say, by 70%. What do you, you know, how do we move forward in terms of that?
Just to be clear for anybody, our goal is to end child abuse, neglect, and domestic violence. Of course, we just did not think that was realistic by 2030. But in terms of trauma, you're absolutely right. Trauma underlies, you know, you look at problems in society, problems of addiction, problems of homelessness, problems of domestic abuse, problems of the financial state of the nation. Trauma underlies multiple problems in our society. Scotland has actually, along with Wales, has been much, much better at recognising this than England has been so far. But they're still not very good at putting things into practice. I sat as a witness to the Scottish Finance Committee in 2010 that recommended to the Scottish Parliament that it should make prevention the absolute centrepiece of its policies for children. And wonderfully, the Scottish Government agreed to do so. But the Scottish Finance Committee has since then twice written to the Scottish Government saying, sorry guys, you're actually not doing what you said you would do. And I still think they're not doing it. But if you ever write a letter to a minister or get someone to write a letter to a minister, the answer, which always comes from the civil servants, says, let us tell you all the things we're doing, which they claim are actually preventing trauma. Well, I'm not saying they're not good things. There's some brilliant things the Scottish Government has done. Perhaps the most brilliant of all is the extra resource they put into health visitors, for example. So there's lots and lots of good things being done, but they're not doing it in a way or at the level that would produce the 70-30 result. That's why our Commission of Inquiry is doing the work that we're doing. And obviously, once we have summarised our results, then we will be engaging with the Scottish Government and all the political parties in Scotland and the local authorities in Scotland in that topic. But somehow, trauma, recognition of it, trauma-informed communities, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed prisons, trauma-informed police forces, trauma-informed social services, these have all to become part of the warp and weft of Scottish society. Actually, while the English government has lagged behind Scotland and Wales in recognising prevention of trauma, English local authorities are way ahead of Scottish local authorities in tackling trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed care. For example, I just spent 2 years working as an advisor to Hampshire, Portsmouth, Southampton, and the Isle of Wight on how to make those 4 local authority areas trauma-informed in every aspect of life. Police, prisons, all the things I've said. And they're committed to it. They have action groups working in their local authorities on how to put it into practice. We were invited to write a strategy document for them, including action plans for 18 separate statutory agencies in how to implement trauma-informed practice and prevention of ACEs. So they're not ignoring prevention alongside all of that. The big challenge that everyone has is money. Local authorities all over the UK are suffering from lack of money because central government has followed for a long time policy, particularly the UK government, of putting greater responsibility in the hands of local authorities, but taking more and more money away from local authorities. So local authorities are asked to do more and more with less and less money. Somehow we got to change that if we're going to succeed. But in fact, the economic case, sometimes it's advantageous being an economist as well as the other things I am, the economic case for prevention is marvelous. It's powerful and it's strong. One of the recommendations that we are likely to make to the Scottish Government, which we've already made to the 4 local authorities I've just mentioned in England, is to introduce in Scotland an approach called self-healing communities. They're actually trauma-informed communities. This is something used in Washington State 15 years. In Washington State, it slashed levels of child abuse, neglect, ACEs, youth violence, domestic violence, teenage pregnancy, and youth suicides. And financially, it cost the state of Washington an investment of $3.4 million a year. And when they got someone to do an economic assessment of its impact, they concluded that it had saved them $120 million a year.
Wow.
You imagine going to your bank tomorrow and putting in £34 to your bank and going back to that bank 1 year later and saying, how much is my money worth? And your bank says it's worth £1,200. That's the rate of return Washington State got. We have to persuade the Scottish Government, and first of all, Robertson Trust to fund us, to have the resource to do what we need to do to make that case. But that's what we're aiming to do. Sorry, Lindsay, you've had your hand up a long time.
Thank you, George.
That's okay. It's not that my arm's getting tired with it being so digital. Yeah, nice to meet you, George. I have had a look at the website. I didn't know as much as you've just told us, which is just mind-blowing. It's great stuff to hear. Just a couple of things to kind of comment on. I suppose, I don't know if you had, you were busy filling in your application for funding yesterday, so you maybe didn't see. I've been doing some sort of regulating activities with the group, and the first time there was a few of us who did it yesterday, and my cat jumped up. Now, my cat has got a sense as to when she's needed, because she's not been up the rest of the time, but when you were speaking, up she jumped again. It's such difficult things you have to say that it's really difficult to hear. And I think that probably goes for anybody who's listening to what you have to say. And something that I heard recently, which I haven't kind of processed yet, is not only is it difficult to hear the hard things about what's going on in life that's really unpleasant, but it can also be hard to hear that there is hope. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, firstly, your cat's better than the one that I had, which used to just come and lay on my computer keyboard as a very effective way of telling me that it wasn't getting enough attention. So congratulations to your cat for being so well behaved. This is a hard message. Many people just don't want to hear this. And I discovered very early in my work, when I talked to politicians about child abuse, they switched off. I had to talk to them about violence. They care about violence because they know that people vote to have less violence on the streets and to be less at risk of violence. But generally, people don't decide which party to vote for at a political election by their policies on child abuse. So I found that I had to talk to politicians about violence and become an expert in violence to get them to listen to me. Once they were listening to me, I could then say to them, by the way, if you want to stop violence, the first step is to stop child abuse, neglect, and domestic violence. Would you like to know how? And then I've got their ears. But there is hope. There is hope. And I think that message is very important. And I find the people who really want to hear the message of hope more than anyone are those who have suffered trauma in their lives. And the knowledge that they can be acknowledged, not as people who have got some kind of deficit. Let me tell you, the number of people with trauma I've met who are brilliant is innumerable. My colleague in setting up WAVE was a lady called Ita Walsh. If you look at WAVE's reports on our website, you'll see the name Ita Walsh over and over again. Sadly, Ita died in 2019. Ita Walsh had 9 ACEs out of 10. Yet she's the most brilliant person I've ever worked with in my life. People with ACEs can be absolutely brilliant. And that does not mean they don't have handicaps. Ita had handicaps, that held her back in some way. But you can overcome those with the right support. Some of you are part of a peer support group that can help you. Peer support is a great way because it doesn't cost the money that expensive private therapists can charge when the NHS lets you down by telling you there's a 2-year waiting list, or you can only see them for 3 months and then your time is up. Imagine if you had a broken back and they started treating it and then turned around after 3 months or 12 months and said, sorry, your time is up now. We don't treat broken backs after 3 months. But in mental health, we do that to people. So there is hope, and we just have to keep getting that message out. And listen, I think the most recent study in Scotland said 70% of people in Scotland have ACEs. 70%. If even a fraction of that 70% started working for the 70-30 campaign and telling MPs that they better implement it, we would overwhelm the politicians and they'd all be acting on it. And who's going to do that? Not me. It'll be our ambassadors. And that's why our ambassadors are key to the future.
Thank you. I take from that very much that the hope isn't a sort of blind, ungrounded thing, but a very grounded, centred course of action.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
George, I want to say thank you. I mean, I've had my tissues and everything because, when you speak, it's right in here that I hear it. And I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to the WAVE Trust. They have, and I know he's not here, and I know he won't mind me messaging because I've already messaged him to tell him I've got my tissues out. But to the amazing Alex, because what he does, finding ambassadors, finding us training, keeping us going, messaging, I can't fault him. He's absolutely amazing. And a lot of what we've learned here has come directly from him. He's wonderful. And the group at WAVE Trust, the education that we've had is amazing. And I would applaud and ask anybody and everybody who is interested in this topic, who has got a lived experience in this area, and who has ACEs, any, from 1 to 10, trauma is trauma, and, get in touch with the WAVE Trust, become an ambassador, and lift the voices, because that's how we get change. And thank you, George. I cannot thank you enough for joining us today.
It's my privilege to have been with you. And we didn't get to talk about adoption, but I really want you to know you have my support with your very important position. Do not give up. As we have proved, when we started, I remember the first time I spoke to the Home Secretary, it was Jack Straw was the Home Secretary at that time. He just said to me, George, we've got all this handled. It's nothing to do with ACEs, it's all to do with poverty. All we got to do is solve poverty and all the problems will go away. Well, he's actually got it the wrong way around. The way to solve poverty is first to solve ACEs. That's not to say poverty isn't an important issue to topic, it absolutely is. But we were dismissed and sent away, but we didn't give up. We kept coming back. We came back with evidence, and that in the end got through. You do the same, you will win.
Thank you, George.